Hello, History72B Spring Quarter 2023. I'm your host, Karen, and I will be leading you through this quarter. I am looking forward to meeting you in person during our scheduled course times. We will be using an inverted classroom format. In this case, lectures will be on videos like this. You will have access to these video lectures from the time they are posted to the end of the quarter. We will use our regularly scheduled course times, Tuesday, Thursday, for Q&A and to work on writing. Those session times are not mandatory after the first one. This is your Welcome to the Class lecture. In this lecture, we will be considering what you have signed on for by taking this class with me in terms of both subject matter and course format. Starting with lecture format, I put an outline near the beginning of each lecture so that you can see at a glance which topics are covered in any particular video. I will be going through inverting fairly quickly. So this is our first outline, clearly. I will be going through inverting fairly quickly. Do not panic about things like readings or quizzes until I have gone over my grading system for this course and you have looked at my syllabus. I suggest paying attention to the type of information that I cover in section 3 and then going back to parts periodically. This will make sense. Finally, we will be considering what this class will actually be about. Part 1, Inverting the Classroom. I will be inverting the classroom for this course. Any lecture material that you need to understand will be on video. That gives me an opportunity in the Tuesday, Thursday live sessions to focus more on writing and on clarifying concepts. More on that in a moment. One of the reasons I am inverting the classroom is that I know it can be tricky to balance all the parts of overfilled and complicated lives. The Tuesday, Thursday session times are not mandatory. I know that this will not take away most stress and complications in your lives, but I'm hoping that my class can add as little as possible. The other, and perhaps really the main reason that the lectures are on video, is that I think it offers advantages that live lectures cannot. For example, you can watch videos in parts rather than in one long, exhausting stretch. If your mind wanders, you could go back and watch parts whenever you like. You could watch any part of a video multiple times, and you could watch a video section at midnight, if that helps, or 3 in the morning, like some of us. Use the recorded lecture format to fit your own life and approach to learning. Again, do not panic about readings or so-called quizzes until I have gone over my grading system for this course and you have looked at my syllabus yourself. So, going to the syllabus and understanding grading. The quizzes are not about getting a correct answer, but are a way for you to work out your ideas and to get points. That's explained on the syllabus and later in this lecture, the getting points thing. Collaboration and discussion are excellent ways of learning material. When it comes to entering your answers, however, write out your response for yourself. You can get to the syllabus by using the syllabus tab on the left, circled in red. That will take you to something that looks like this, although this is clearly for another class. When I was young, before there were desktop computers, yes, really, way back then, the syllabus was on paper. We, the students, knew that we could ask about the course subject, but not the workings of the course itself, things like due dates and test locations. If it was in the syllabus, we were expected to find the answer ourselves. No mercy, and woe betide you if you lost that precious piece of paper. The syllabus is still a thing in academia, even if you have regular access to instructors through messaging and emailing. Google, it's in the syllabus, and you will get a million hits, several million hits. There are memes and cartoons. You could buy shirts and pens and embroidery kits. I'm not planning to be so strict or irritable as all this, like what you see on the screen here, but it will make your life easier if you consult the syllabus for course info before you message me. But do feel free to message me if you do not find what you are looking for or if you are confused. It will just take less time to explain things if you've already looked at the material in the syllabus. Think of a syllabus as your user manual for the course. You check through it to see how it is organized and then look up information when you need it. You don't read the entire user manual for your car in one go and remember everything in it. The syllabus that you have when you click on the left is really just an outline. I have all of the parts of the syllabus in the module section on the home page at the very top. And if you got my welcome email, you may have already found that. I find it makes more sense to put syllabus information in the modules on the Canvas homepage so that you do not have to hunt and scroll for it. I'm going to go over some useful parts of the syllabus now and then turn you loose with it. I want to draw your attention to several parts of the syllabus that you should read earlier rather than later. The first of these is on grading, and it's marked grading in your homepage under the syllabus section. If you look at the explanation of grading in those syllabus parts, you'll get a more detailed explanation of how your grade will be calculated than I can really give you here. But you will not be graded on percentages. You will be graded on points accumulated using a standard 100-point scale. If you go over the syllabus, you will see that adding all of the assignments together, there is a possibility for 180 points. I will say this again because this is not the usual grading system and it takes some getting used to. If you end the quarter with 85 points, you are not graded on the basis of a percentage. You are graded on total points using a 100-point scale. If you finish the course with 85 points, you have a B, not an F. You have an 85 points, not 85 out of 180. And this is from an older course. It's 180 now. Read the syllabus for more detail on how the point system and assignments will work. Basically, there are two categories of assignments in the class. Category 1 is informal writing. Those are the quizzes associated with each lecture package. As long as you show engagement with course material and make your answer the required length, about 200 words, you'll get your 3 points. 1 word about the 200, 1 word about the 200 words. For computers, they count every character, every word. But in real life, it's only the words that are substantive, that say something, that matter. So when you calculate your words in your answer, you don't count a, of, the, and usually the easiest thing is to figure out how many meaningful words you have per line and then multiply by the lines. I'm not going to go through and count every single word in every answer, but I have a pretty good eye now, as do my TAs, for what is a good length and what is not. The quizzes, so-called quizzes, are your chance to think in writing without worrying about having the correct answer or whether you are writing well according to the rules. There are 10 weeks and 2 quizzes per week, so there are 20 quizzes for a total of 60 possible points. The one thing that will absolutely positively lose you points is giving me something from sites like Wikipedia or Course Hero. Those sites are full of fun facts, but not all of those fun facts are relevant to this course. I know what information I have included in my own lectures because I consider it important for understanding whichever point I am making. You may be absolutely correct about Thomas Jefferson's shoe size. You will still lose points if you include that in your answer. This class gets you credit for the writing experience requirement. I'm 95% sure, but check me on that. So the formal writing assignments will give you a chance to work on academic paper writing skills for history. You have 8 opportunities to work on your writing skills without tanking your grade. This is an old slide, I recognize, and I don't want to go back and redo all of my slides for this one or the part that I've recorded already. So I will tell you that this quarter, you have 12 points possible per due date in category 2 assignments, and you have 8 possible due dates. Very few people use all 8 of those due dates because it gets to be a lot to fulfill each writing assignment every week. Getting a low number of points in the correct system, not what I have up here from an old class, on a formal writing assignment will not destroy your grade. Percentages do not matter, only points. Please read the syllabus, especially since I messed up this slide, for the Category 2 assignment system. It is a bit Byzantine, and this lecture is already long. I expect questions on this, so come to the course time Q&A for more explanation. I strongly advise looking at these 2 sections, approaching course reading strategically, tackling academic writing, the formal analytical essay for history, in the syllabus section in your modules, at the top of the modules. These are intended to make your life easier, not to give you hard, difficult rules. I will go over some of this in a completely different way to the syllabus in this lecture so that you have both ways of looking at it available to you. Part 3 of this lecture I've called Tricks of the Trade, How to Approach a History Class. The amount of reading and writing in a history class can be daunting if you try to do absolutely every single thing and do them all perfectly. So for this section, I suggest paying attention to the type of information that I cover and then going back to parts of this lecture periodically. This will make more sense in a moment. I will give you 6 major pieces of general advice before we start in on strategy. First, do not get stuck in the details. We all do it, particularly if material is new to us, and we do not already have a framework of knowledge. Start by acknowledging how familiar, or not, you are with the particular material you are working with, and adjust your expectations of what you want to get from a reading or lecture. If you get more than you first expected, you're likely to be pleased, and for good reason. If you expect to remember absolutely everything we cover by June, you are very likely to be disappointed. Second, resign yourself to not being able to read every word or to learn every detail. This goes for any level of study in history. Very few people in history can actually read everything that they would like to as completely as they would like to. The more you know about a time, place, and historical question, the more quickly you could get through any given source. But the more you know, the more sources you want or need to get through, and the more you realize what you do not know. So it all sorts of balances out. Third, approach everything in history, readings, lectures, writing assignments from the surface or the biggest parts, and then work your way through levels toward the details. If you focus on the details first, you will quickly become overwhelmed. So, for example, don't focus first on trying to remember names and dates. Focus first on thinking about why I'm telling you about certain names or dates. General advice number 4. Don't feel like you have to enjoy every lecture or reading to enjoy history as a discipline. You will want to dig deeper into some topics than others, and that's perfectly fine. General advice number 5. You are an individual with your own interests, your own experiences, and your own perspectives. Do not assume that if your perspective differs from your instructors, that would be me, that you have to keep quiet. I suppose I would prefer that you don't stand up in the classroom and shout that I am an idiot. But you can certainly talk to me if you think that I am off base on anything. Students are not the only ones who learn in a class. Just don't shout insults, please. And finally, strategize. What I mean here is that while poking into history randomly is quite fun, and I encourage it when you have time and resources, when it comes to doing assignments, you need to be more efficient. Having a basic plan of action for a course when it comes to approaching material, whether it's watching lectures or doing writing assignments or doing reading, having that plan will help with stress reduction and efficiency. Unless the plan is, I will start at the beginning and do absolutely every bit of everything in order, start to finish. And that's not a good strategy. This brings us to how to approach history reading. You are looking at the Trinity College Library in Dublin, Ireland. If I were immortal, I would want to while away my immortality in this place or at the Bodleian at Oxford. But short of immortality, there is no human who can read every book, even just the books shown in this one room on the slide. So one strategy we will need in a 10-week class is to have a strategy for approaching readings in history. The first step is to figure out whether you have what is called a primary or a secondary source, or something of both. A primary source is something produced at the time the historian is studying. Primary sources are often text or writing-based, court records, diaries, land deeds, household accounts, but not always. For example, photographs can be a primary source, as long as they were produced at the time the historian is studying. Secondary sources are scholarly works produced by researchers. In other words, secondary sources provide the insights and data that earlier historians have created. When you want to figure out whether you have a primary or secondary source, start by asking yourself a list of questions. What type of thing are you looking at? Where did you find it? And the answer to that could be on a Canvas course site. And why are you looking at it? And the answer to that could be because it was assigned to me. We will look at 2 books so that you can see how to decide whether they are primary or secondary. The particular copy of the book that you're looking at here is recent, but the text was originally published in 1861 in the first year of the Civil War, as it happens. Long enough ago that you would start thinking primary source immediately. When you find out who the author was and why they wrote the book, you know that this is a primary source. The author is not a recent scholar, and the book presents the story of the writer's life and a critique of slavery. This book is loaded with information, but it was not written for the purpose of conveying the results of scholarly analysis. Primary sources are the materials that historians analyze. We will cover how to tackle primary sources later in the quarter. This book was published in 2010, so that's actually fairly recent. The author is an historian and, in fact, is in the history department here at UC Davis. This book examines the past, the 1930s, but it is an analysis of why things happened the way that they did. This work is based on the analysis of both primary and secondary sources. Much of what you will read in this class is secondary, scholarly material. If you have a secondary source, you will move on to part B of your reading strategy. Determine what type of secondary source you are looking at. You are most likely to have one of the following: an historical monograph or book, mono, single, graph to write. So a monograph focuses on a single historical question. You may have a chapter in an edited volume, in which case the different chapters may be written by different people and they center on a particular theme. Or you may have a paper that appeared in a professional journal. If you have a secondary source, it will never be a novel. Never. Novels are works of fiction intended primarily to entertain the reader. Almost all legitimate scholarly works have been what is called peer-reviewed. We do not get to publish whatever we want. Publishers and editors review work to make certain that it is actually valid work that contributes to the field before any secondary source comes out in print. Be aware, there are things that are not secondary sources, but that can fool you. These include articles in popular magazines, newspapers, and websites. Your approach and expectations will be different for those than for scholarly historical sources. We will talk about how to use these types of resources another time, maybe. If these were produced around 20 or more years ago, some of these could actually be primary sources for the time period covered in this class. Assuming that you do have a bona fide secondary source, what do you do next? Remember, you are an honorary historian as long as you are in this class, and historians cannot read everything we need, much less everything we want to read. I think that this picture was probably taken in a bookstore, but it could easily be my home. Spouse periodically complains about this, which changes nothing. Historians know that other historians cannot read everything all the time. Historical works, whether monograph, chapter, or paper, are constructed with the idea that the reader is going to gut the text. I will explain gutting. Historians know that other historians cannot read everything all the time. So we plan on having our readers gut our work and try to make the gutting easy. What exactly is gutting? It is not the same thing as skimming a reading. Just go with me here. This analogy is ridiculous, but I've found that the ridiculousness makes it easier to remember the process. I'm going to spend some time on gutting because it will make your life in history classes both more pleasant and more efficient. So, regardless of the length of a text, whether it's a paper or a monograph, a book, a secondary historical source is a fish. Step A in gutting secondary sources is to look at your fish. Don't ignore titles. They can be quite informative. Who wrote the book, chapter, or article that you have? What is their scholarly affiliation? Are they trained in history or in another academic field? When did they write the book or chapter or paper? The gutting method is the same for all of those. I'm likely to just say book from here on. How long ago was your text written relative to the time that you are reading it? There are always at least 3 levels of historical context to keep in mind for a secondary source. The historical context being analyzed, the historical context in which the text was written, the writer's or scholar's historical context, and our own historical context. We will be revisiting that last one throughout the whole course. It is critical, especially for time periods leading into our own, to remember that the historical context is not the same as our own. It may be recent. It has almost certainly shaped our world now to some degree, but it is not our world now. And I will add here, this is not to give people in the past a pass on unkind behavior. It is so that we can understand the context in which people made the choices that they made. Back to gutting your source. Step B, scale your fish. Look at the table of contents if you have a book. It will tell you more than just page numbers on the right. Read the names of the chapters. Is the book primarily organized chronologically, meaning by time? Or is it organized thematically, meaning by analytical basis? Just looking at the table of contents, you will be able to see how the author has organized their book and the type of story that they are going to tell. This also works for papers. Look at section headings if the paper has them. And early hint, this also works for my class and for each of my lectures. Cut off the head of your fish. Read the beginning or introduction of your text. Sometimes, like on the example shown, it's already labeled for you, introduction. Otherwise, it's usually the first chapter. Once you have read the introduction, you should know the when, where, who, and what that the book will examine. And you should have at least some idea of the why question the author will be answering in their text. Next, cut off the tail, meaning read the conclusion of the book. Don't try to go from the front of the book straight through to the last page. Read the introduction, go straight to the tail. Sometimes the conclusion will be nicely labeled, like here, and sometimes you will have to figure it out. It's the last paragraph or two of a paper or short book, and the last chapter usually in most books. By the time you finish the conclusion, you should know the why question the author has answered in the book and what their answer to that question is. In other words, the big argument that the author is making. The argument is the entire point of historical writing. The story told and the sources cited are the evidence and experimental results to historians. An argument is not an opinion. An argument is not just what the historian thinks about a topic. That might be a starting hypothesis. But in history, the argument represents the conclusions that an historian has drawn based on close study of their available data. For some texts, you will only ever gut them to the stage that I've shown here, cutting off the head, cutting off the tail after looking at the surface of the fish. If you want to go to an author's talk, but you didn't have time to read their entire book, the talk is in an hour, and you just found out about it, getting this far is enough to orient you for the talk. But assuming it's for class or for a paper that you're writing, you want to keep going. Remove the viscera from your fish. Viscera are the internal organs, or appropriately here, the guts. For a book, removing the viscera means reading chapter and section titles, topic sentences, and the first and last paragraphs of each chapter or section. This gives you the how the historian has backed up their conclusions. The author anticipates the questions an informed reader is likely to ask before that reader will be convinced by the main argument. This step lets you figure out the lines of logic and reasoning that the author is using in answering those questions. The process of gutting is not the same thing as skimming or scanning. In gutting, you do want to pause and think as you work through the text, and you do want to read some parts in depth. Once you get to this step, the gutting, the removing the viscera step, you know enough about the text to find material for a paper or a discussion section question quickly and efficiently. You might not remember it from reading it, but you can find it really quickly. If a text is extremely important to your research interests, you will take your fish apart more thoroughly. You will want to cut out the fillets, meaning figure out what type of evidence the scholar is using. For historians, evidence is drawn from a mix of primary and secondary sources. You will need to consider what the type of sources used can tell you about how your scholar will go about proving their points to support their argument. For people new to history, footnotes seem like a bizarre vestige of outdated historical presentation. They certainly did to me at first. But for historians, the footnotes are our materials and methods section. They can lead us to other secondary sources or to new archives that could be incredibly useful. You will sometimes encounter endnotes. Endnotes are the same as footnotes, but they are at the end of a paper, chapter, or book instead of at the bottom or the foot of the pages. Decide whether you want to cook and eat any part of your fish. This means that you decide if you want to read a text or any part of it closely. This is a personal calculation that you will make based on your own interest, reason for reading, time, and energy. You can always free some or all of the fish to eat later. In other words, you remember enough about the book to know when it will be useful to you and keep the book or notes on it where you can find it when you want it. dead tree books you put on shelves or stacked on your floor, and electronic material archived with notes will allow you to find what you need a year or more after you've read the book or gutted the book. You cannot remember everything in every book. If there's one of you with photographic memory, then maybe you can, but most of us cannot. But you can remember which book or paper had that information or argument that would be really useful to you right now. If you are still going with your text, cook, eat, and enjoy. Read what interests you the most or what will help you answer a question more closely. Dig into those details that I made you skip over before. If you follow the basic rules and order of preparing a fish, you will enjoy it much more than if you try to drop it whole and raw into your mouth. If you follow the basic rules for reading history, you will enjoy history classes far more than if you try to read every word from the beginning to the end. So, what is this class actually about? To refresh your memory, this course is called Women and Gender in America, 1865 to the Present. This title does not tell you that you will be studying specifically the history of women and gender, but that's fairly easy to figure out as long as you know that 1865 refers to a year and not, say, to a geographic point or a price. You can also figure out that this is a history class from the course number, although that means that you need to be able to read and understand the UC Davis registration material. This 1865 to the present bit is interesting. If you know U.S. history, then you know that the 1865 marks the end of the American Civil War and the beginning of the period usually referred to as Reconstruction in U.S. history. Present is actually more vague than it seems. Within 20 years of wherever we are currently in time tends not to be particularly amenable to historical method or to seeing big changes that lead to some new pattern. In fact, it's hard to pick out patterns in a world we are immersed in. This is why people generally feel that there is more variability to, say, clothing choices or fashion now than there were in preceding centuries. We are deep in the weeds of our own time, but tend to wave away variation in the past as part of some larger trend, which it usually is, just as it is now. And future generations will have narratives for the 2020s, which may or may not jibe with your own experiences and memories in some ways. That is a common observation on history, but I can back it up with personal experience, since I am a primary source now. That means I'm old. Once we reach the 1960s, I am a primary source. I know the narratives and conclusions at which current scholars have arrived about the 1960s to around 2000. But those narratives are not my lived narrative in every way. Partly, I'm telling you this because my lived context will influence my presentation to a great degree from that point, the 1960s, late 1960s, really on. But also, I'm telling you this so that you start thinking about the fact that big trends and narratives in history are just that, big, which immediately excludes the small trends which affect but don't necessarily represent individual experiences and narratives, the stories we tell to make sense of the past. I'm not entirely certain that I will take this class all the way up to the year 2000. So if there is a particular topic from the 1990s, say, that you would definitely want to see covered, let me know soon so that I can try to fit it in. If you are looking at the slide, then you might realize that we could spend 10 weeks just on the half century of my own life, and the course covers more than twice that. Clearly, I hope it's clear, this course cannot be more than a highlights reel. The words in the course name are Women and Gender in America, which again seems very straightforward at first glance, but it's really not. For example, just consider the America part. If we take that to mean the United States, then we will be considering political boundaries that have changed considerably in geographic space and in cultural character over the period covered by this class. The map you're looking at this slide here is 1870. Only the orange regions are states. The light blue are territories, they're not states. And the green are what was called unorganized territories. The official name of Mexico, which is not shown on this map, but is contiguous with the United States, clearly, geographically. The name of Mexico also includes the words United States, but many of you probably assumed correctly that we will not be focusing primarily or exclusively on Mexico. We derive more information from the title than just what we get through the words, although that information may not always be quite what the writer, in this case, of course catalogs, intended. You know how to read these meanings hidden behind the words in the course title because you and the writer are working more or less in the same historical context. But if we read words written a century ago, or if someone a century from now reads our words, they will be working in a different historical context. And chances are good that some of the taken for granted meanings are lost, or at least difficult to trace. In some cases, the words themselves change meaning significantly, or the meaning is applied to an entirely new word. Elizabethan English, that would be 1500s during the reign of Elizabeth I, so think Shakespeare. Elizabethan English is fun to play with. The line on the left is reasonably well known. Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? But people now often interpret wherefore as where rather than the actual meaning, which was why. So why do you have to be Romeo? Thou is interesting to us in this class, a class centered on gender. If people complain about the use of the pronoun they for a single individual, you can mention that English speakers a few centuries ago were equally appalled when the plural you began to be used in place of the singular pronoun thou. Figuring out Elizabethan insults can be great fun. Some make sense to us now, even if we no longer use them. So, for instance, you have not so much brain as earwax and foot liquor. Others are a bit trickier. Thou debauched fish thou, you Rampalian, you Fustelarian. Although we know now that this one was thrown at a single individual, the thou, and that the other two, the you, were hurled at least a pair of people. My favorite Elizabethan insult is not on here. It is lily-livered louse. I've always loved it for the alliteration, meaning all those L's at the beginning. I enjoy it even more now that I understand why it was an insult. Ask in a Tuesday, Thursday session or email me if you want to know why that was an insult. Returning to the course name, though, the first words here, women and gender, the theme of the course, is the most difficult part of the title to pin down. Historians study change over time, so we will be looking at how ideas, ideals, and practices surrounding gender, sex, women, men, and the use of all of those words has changed considerably over time and space. In the next lecture, we will examine some properties of language and explain a few theoretical models central to this course. But for now, I want you to be aware that whatever these words mean now is correct in our sense, only in our own now historical context. And I can vouch for the amount that historical context can change in a relatively short time period, like my life. The words sex and gender are now used to mean somewhat different things. You can see that on the right and the left of the slide. However, prior to the 1960s, just the 1960s, that recently, this was not the case. This absolutely does not mean that people in the past did not know better or have concepts that might align somewhat with our sex-gender concepts. What it does mean is that these words in English were only assigned separate meanings recently, and in the past they were used correctly to communicate meaning in a different historical context. The sex-gender split is something that we will look at later in this course. But for now, the split in meaning that we recognize currently, mostly in academia, occurred around the time that I was born, the 1960s. And the split was initially made in the context of denying that individuals have any innate sense of their own sex, that bodies and sense of self could be changed at the will of physicians if done early in life. People tend to be more familiar with the use of the separation of body and social role by feminists in the 1970s. They use this to make the point that gender roles do not arise naturally from the sex of the body, another part of history, the feminism and how that was used, that we will look at in this class. This word in our lecture title, woman, there is not and was not in the past a single, cohesive, consistent definition of this word. Part of 72B will examine some of the major shifts in definition that happened in the late 19th and through the 20th century, and why this word is still not as well defined as we might like for it to be. I put an outline near the beginning of lectures. I also summarize key points at the end. You can pause on slides and enlarge them, and you can fast forward to the key points so that you know what you will find in the lecture. Stay tuned in here for a little bit longer. Key points for Lecture 1. Practice navigating the Canvas course site so that you know how to access lectures, readings, assignments, quizzes, and due dates, and more. Look over the syllabus on the course site. The syllabus explains how the course will be structured, how your grades will be determined, the nature of assignments and how they are scored, advice on how to approach course readings, as well as lecture videos strategically and efficiently, and more. Know the difference between a primary source, something created at the time you are studying, and a secondary source, a scholarly work explaining why the past developed as it did in particular historical contexts. Historians need to keep at least 3 levels of historical context in mind at all times. The historical context around the people they're studying, the historical context, or context plural, in which other historians asked their questions, did their analysis, and wrote their texts, and our own historical context. We are not at the end of history. We cannot know what the history of the future will look like because it has not happened yet. We do not have an historical view untouched by our own historical context. Understand how to gut a scholarly text by an historian. This will help you manage your workload realistically. It will teach you how to pick out key points in reading quickly and efficiently, and it will help you understand better how to structure your own formal essays in this class and why you structure them that way. Words and concepts and word concept packages change over time, often dramatically. Do not assume that a writer or lecturer means the same thing that you mean when using words like woman or gender. For whatever reason, I find it uncomfortable to end a lecture video abruptly on the last key point. Pretty much all of my lectures will have a coda. A coda is a tail or a bit at the end, and these will have a variable level of seriousness and information content. These coda will also vary in length. You are not responsible for knowing anything that I present in the codas, and you are not required to watch them. This lecture has a short coda. It's a fish gutting a book. You can tell the fish is gutting and not trying to read every word because the fish is smiling and not crying into the book.